Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here. I know most of you were probably here for the donuts and you weren't here for me, but I appreciate you being here anyway. We're going to continue in Matthew chapter 21. We're getting to the point where in Matthew's gospel account, and all the gospel writers do this to an extent, Matthew's no exception, when you get to what they call the Passion Week, or some denominational groups call it Holy Week, this is the week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. When you get to this point in the gospel accounts, things really begin to slow down. And what you have in Matthew is you have about, in terms of Jesus' ministry, you have about 20 chapters or so of that, and then you have 8 chapters for a week. And so things really begin to slow down, and that's the gospel writer's way of showing us that these things are important. These things they're emphasizing to us, and in this case, Matthew is showing us the things that are leading up to when Jesus will be killed and then ultimately raised from the dead. And so we've come to chapter 21, and this is where Jesus enters Jerusalem. And so you recall we looked at that last week. He enters Jerusalem in the first 11 verses. And in that lesson last week, we talked about how he rode in triumphantly with a royal procession. And so you may recall, he rides in, he doesn't walk in. Pilgrims would walk into a city. Jesus, he does not walk, he sits because he is the king. So he rides in, and this fulfills prophecy, as Matthew alludes to from Zechariah 9 and verse 9, that the king comes humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt. And we read also that as he was coming in, they spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches and put them down. And so this has the makings of a royal procession. This is a king entering his new place of where he is reigning. And so this is a sort of triumphant royal procession that Jesus is engaged in. And yet he also does so with humility. Part of the prophecy that Matthew quotes from Zechariah 9 is the fact that the king is coming humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. And so he does this in a humble manner. He doesn't come in on a war horse like you might see a typical king do when they've just conquered a new place and they're taking their place. But he does so on a donkey and on a colt. And so there's a royal procession here, but it's also humble. And so the juxtaposition here is really intriguing with what Jesus is doing. And so we left off with the king arriving. The king makes his entrance. And now we're going to see the first place where the king goes. And so imagine if you're thinking of a king in a secular manner. A king is entering his new territory, something that he's just perhaps acquired, or perhaps he's just taken his place as king. Where's the first place you typically go? You might think they would go to their palace, to their throne. Well, notice where Jesus goes. The king goes to his house being the temple. And so Matthew 21, starting in verse 12, it says, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, 'It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers.' And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, 'Hosanna to the Son of David,' they were indignant. And they said to him, 'Do you hear what these are saying?' And Jesus said to them, 'Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise?' And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there." So the king has entered his house. He goes to the temple. The temple, of course, and you may know this if you've been involved in our Wednesday night Bible study. Jim has really outlined this pretty well for us over the last few months. The temple is God's house. And what we mean by that is this is where God's presence was manifested in Jerusalem. It began with the Ark of the Covenant, which we've looked at a little bit in my Chronicles sermon series. We're going to look at that a little more today, not a lot, but so it begins with the Ark of the Covenant. That was God's presence there among the people. The Levites carried it on poles, the Ark, and it was God's presence with them as they went through the wilderness. Eventually, once they inherit the Promised Land, they put the Ark in a tent, and David eventually says, we need to build a house for God. His son Solomon ends up building that house, and there's this temple that is in Jerusalem, and this is where God's presence was manifested among the people in a sort of symbolic way. And so on the one hand, you have the temple here, and this by now is, of course, the second temple, because as you may remember, the first temple gets destroyed by the Babylonians in around 586 BC. That's when the Jews go into Babylonian captivity. They get called back and so on and so forth, and they rebuild the temple in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. You may remember that from a Wednesday night study we did a year or two or however long ago. And so this is the second temple, and this temple has been renovated. It was renovated by Herod, the king, Herod the Great, the baby killer Herod. And so this was commonly known as Herod's temple due to the renovations that he oversaw with this temple. And what he did is he turned the temple into a big, grand display. But it wasn't to glorify God, it was to glorify Herod, more or less, was his motivation for that. Secular history, I think, shows us that. And so you have, on the one hand, Solomon's temple, which Solomon built. Then you have the second temple, which they built after they came back from Babylonian captivity. And then you have modifications made to it, and so they call it Herod's temple. And so it's a little ironic. On the one hand, it's God's house, but they commonly refer to it as Herod's temple. And this is a diagram just to kind of get you an idea of what this would look like. This obviously was a pretty big area, and you have different things here. You have on the outside the Gentiles' courtyard. Gentiles could only come to this point. Then you enter inward, and this right here, this little square, was the woman's courtyard. That's where Jewish women could be. Then ordinary men could be in this area here, and this area is where the priests could go. And then you have the holy place here, which is where the inner room is, the veil is in there, and so on and so forth. And so this is what Herod's temple looked like. And so the temple is actually a pretty big campus. Think of it more as a campus than as a building, because there's courtyards, and there's different chambers, and there's gates, and so on and so forth. And so it's really more of a campus than as a building. And so when you hear talk of the temple, they may not necessarily be in the room where God's presence was really manifest, the Holy of Holies, but more or less in that courtyard area. And so Jesus enters the temple campus. And what's the first thing that Jesus does when he's in the temple? For an ordinary Jew, if they were to go to the temple, there's a number of things they could do. They could do things like pray. Prayer was pretty common in the temple. If you lived in Jerusalem, at certain times you would go and you would pray, right? You could do that outside of the temple as well, but it was common to do that in the temple. We see that in the New Testament a few times. You could also bring an offering. Perhaps if you're Jesus, you could go to the temple and teach, right? Because Jesus is, of course, a teacher. And so what is it that Jesus does when he first goes to the temple? Well, he doesn't go to pray. He doesn't go to bring an offering. And he isn't necessarily teaching. He might be teaching implicitly by his actions, but he's not standing up and giving a lesson. What he does, as we see in verse 12, it says, he drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. You commonly hear this referred to as Jesus cleansing the temple. I don't like that description because that almost makes it seem like it's a permanent thing. You could pretty well assume that after Jesus leaves there, they get back to doing what they were doing. This is really more of a demonstration. You might think of it sort of as a way to show a protest more than anything, not necessarily something that's going to lead to change, although they should have changed. Jesus going in there and doing this should have alarmed them, but they don't listen, which is typical. And so he goes in, he drives out those who are buying and selling, He overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who are selling pigeons. And so this kind of raises a couple of questions. On the one hand, why are there people buying and selling in the temple? You think of the temple, and in our minds, we think of it as a church building, a place where you go and you have worship services at. And so it would be a little weird if we, and some churches do this, big denominational churches go and they might have a coffee shop and they have a barista on staff and they make you the lattes with the foamy milk and all of that. Or maybe they have gift shops or whatever. In our minds, that'd be a little weird. At least my thinking it would be. And so this is kind of an odd thing to think about. Why are people selling and buying in the temple? Because you think of a temple or you think of a church building, it's not typically a place of business, right? Well, one thing that's interesting is thinking of Judaism in this particular time, it's really gotten far off from how God had originally set up the Jewish religion for the Jewish people. At this point, when Jesus is on the earth, when Jesus is active in his ministry, at this point in what you commonly hear referred to as Second Temple Judaism, because it's a lot different than during the time of the First Temple, the priests authorized a sort of marketplace to go on in the court of the temple, the outer court primarily. And so it took place primarily in that Gentile courtyard. That's kind of just on the outskirts of the actual campus of the temple. And so there's this sort of marketplace that began happening out there. And the primary thing, it's not like a concession stand where you go and you buy a pop or you buy a bag of chips or something. It's not like that. But what this was is it had animals that you could buy that could be purchased for sacrifices. This is what this marketplace was, among other things, but primarily it was where you could buy an animal to use for a sacrifice. And one thing that's interesting, this perhaps started from a good place, perhaps out of something that was necessary. If you lived in Jerusalem, you may not have needed this, but imagine you're someone living in a faraway place, someone who is one of the exiled Jews or one of the Jews living not in Jerusalem and perhaps not even in Judea. Say you live in Galilee, where Jesus is from, and you make this journey to Jerusalem, or say you live in one of the other places like we see on the day of Pentecost. There were Jews there from all over the place. That's part of the miracle of the apostles speaking in tongues. They're able to speak in all these different languages. And so perhaps this started from a good place, because you can imagine if you're coming from far away, you may not, practically speaking, be able to bring an animal with you to sacrifice. The journey may be too far. Your animal simply may not make it. And so the market, you could see it being a matter of convenience on the one hand, where you just go, you make a purchase, you buy an animal, and then you offer that animal. But perhaps this was a necessity for certain people as well. But unfortunately, this balloons into something that is very, very corrupt, something that is part of why Jesus goes in and does this demonstration that he does. And part of this is just kind of natural snowballing, where you have one thing and it kind of, a slippery slope kind of thing, it leads to other things. One of the things that is at work here is in the temple they used a different currency. It would be as if here at the church building we had a special currency that was not U.S. dollars. It would be as if we had our own currency. And so how this would be, if you've ever been to a different country, like if you've been to, say, Mexico or some other place, there are different, Europe especially with the euro and so on, there are different conversions you have to go through, and typically you'd go to a money changer, you'd give them a certain amount of United States dollars, and they'll give you the equivalent back of whatever the currency is, if it's the euro or pesos or whatever. Well, this was needed in the temple in order to do all these things, because in the temple they had their own currency. They didn't use the Roman currency or the Greek currency, because it had Roman and Greek gods on them a lot of times. And so they weren't going to do that, which I think is fine. They don't want pagan things on their currency to be used in the temple. And so they had their own unit of currency in the temple. And so in order to have these transactions, you had to have money changers. you had to have someone who, if you gave them a Greek or a Roman currency, they could give you a temple currency back. And unfortunately, what ended up happening, and you can look at secular history and you can read into this, Josephus talks about this, is how it wasn't just a flat rate, but those money changers took a fee, and a lot of times it ended up ballooning into a pretty large fee, where perhaps they charge you even 100%, where you're giving them double the money and they only give you half back, or whatever it might be. It ended up becoming a very corrupt practice, and part of why this was so corrupt is they kind of had a monopoly on it. They could pretty well do whatever they pleased because there was no competition. If you wanted to go and make a sacrifice and you wanted to pay for it there, if you wanted to buy the animal there, you had to do it in accordance with how they had it. And so on the one hand, you have these money changers who are taking a large fee for their service. And then there's something else that's interesting, and you may not necessarily read into this, but there's something interesting that's mentioned here. It mentions in this, and I've never given this much thought, but as I was studying for this, it kind of made sense to me. It mentions in verse 12 that he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. It's interesting that as Matthew is depicting this, he points out that he overturned not just the money changers' tables, but the seats of those who were selling pigeons. That's kind of oddly specific, because he initially in the beginning says that Jesus drove out all those who sold and bought. Those who sold would include those who sold pigeons. Yet here Jesus overturns their seats. And so why single these people out who are selling the pigeons? Well, first we need to understand why there are people selling pigeons in the first place. Because typically the animals you'd use for a sacrifice would be a lamb or a ram or something along those lines. But there's a principle outlined in the Old Testament, primarily in Leviticus, and you see it in Leviticus 5, where if you could not afford a lamb, if you were poor, and you could not have a lamb, if you were that poor, you could purchase 2 doves or 2 pigeons instead, and that would be the equivalent of offering a lamb. That principle is outlined in Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 7, among other places. It's mentioned multiple times. And so this is something that God allowed them to do. If you were poor, if you could not afford to have a lamb to use as a sacrifice, you could purchase 2 doves or 2 pigeons, and then you could offer those instead. Well, what ended up happening, this is supposed to be a cheap option. This is supposed to be for poor people, and yet this ballooned to also be too expensive. This, what is supposed to be a cheaper alternative if you're poor, ends up becoming unaffordable. There's an interesting mention of this in the Jewish Mishnah. This is one of the traditional texts that the Jewish people have, and by traditional I mean this is their tradition, the Mishnah is. And so there's a reference here from, and I don't understand the reference, but I put it on the screen because someone else might. But there's mention here about a pair of birds in Jerusalem went up to a golden dinar or denarius, right? That's one of their currencies. So in this section of the Mishnah, it mentions that the price of birds went up to a golden denarius. And then this particular rabbi, or this particular person named Simeon B. Gamaliel, I don't know if that's the same Gamaliel that we're familiar with or not, but he says, by this sanctuary I shall not rest tonight until they shall be at silver denarius. In other words, he's not going to rest until they bring that price back down. And so this is a contemporary example written in Jewish tradition of the very thing we're seeing unfolding here, part of why Jesus comes in and he overturns these seats of these people. This is supposed to be an option for the poor, but it's ballooned to the fact to where if you want to make an offering, you've got to give up much more than what you typically would. And that portion isn't going to God, it's going to those who are selling those birds. And so you can see the corruption that is going on here in the temple. And so Jesus takes swift and strong action against this. As Matthew is depicting it, he wastes no time. He goes in and he drives out those who are selling and buying. He overturns these tables and these seats. And so he mentions first, Matthew does, that he drove out those who were selling and buying in the temple. That word drove out is very strong. That's not a light thing. This isn't Jesus going in and shooing them away. The word here that's used implies that this is physical in nature. And the word, this was always easy for me to remember when I was in Greek class. The word for throw is balo. I'd always remember that because it's like you throw a ball, that kind of thing. But the word here is ekbalo. You add that prefix before it, and that means literally throw out. And so this is a physical thing that Jesus is doing here, and that's implicit in the word that Matthew uses to describe this. And so Jesus throws these people out. He forces them out. And you can compare this with another instance where a Jewish king cleanses the temple, quote unquote, found in 2 Chronicles chapter 29. This is when King Hezekiah cleanses the temple. And if you compare this instance to the Greek translation of 2 Chronicles 29, the Septuagint, the same word is used, ekbalo. It's the same word that Jesus uses to drive out these people. It's the same word that's used here, where it says Hezekiah. In the text it says he, so I put Hezekiah in there so you know who we're talking about. Hezekiah brought in the priests and the Levites and assembled them in the square on the east and said to them, "Hear me, Levites. Now consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place." This is the same word in the Greek translation of this text that's used. Carry these things out. So this isn't a metaphorical, you need to get out of here kind of thing. This is something that, based on the wording, is physical. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Jesus violently drove them out, but he made his point known and he drove them away. And so that's one thing that he does. He drives them out, the buyers and the sellers. And he also, again, overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who are selling these pigeons. These are the corrupt people who are pocketing more money than what they should. They're exploiting people who have no other option. There's no competition, right? One of the great things of America is competition. Competition incentivizes innovation and incentivizes markets and so on and so forth. You don't have that here. There's no competition. And so there's a monopoly here, and they're able to charge whatever they want, and they couldn't do anything about it because there was no alternative. In America, if you have something and they're charging you up the wazoo for it, you can go to a competitor who has it for cheaper, and then that drives the market. They'll decrease their price, they'll decrease their price, so on and so forth. That's the idea with the free market and competition. You don't have that here. And so Jesus overturns these things. He overturns the tables, he overturns the seats. The Greek word that's used here is katastrepho. It's where we get our word catastrophe from, or catastrophic. And the meaning of this word, it literally means to turn over. It's the word for turn, which is strepho, and then the prefix kata, which means over, or various meanings, but it literally means to turn over. And in different places, it could also mean something like destroy or ruin. Well, I don't think it's saying that Jesus destroyed their tables or their seats. Rather, he overturned them in a demonstration. And so this demonstration that we see from Jesus, this protest, if you will, it seems to allude to, if not fulfill, something that is prophesied of in Malachi chapter 3. You may remember this quotation, part of it, because part of this is fulfilled by John the Baptizer. In Malachi chapter 3, it says, "Behold, I send my messenger, he'll prepare the way before me," kind of alluding to John. Then it says, "And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." We see here the Lord is in his temple. The king has entered his house, his palace. And so on the one hand, Jesus, of course, fulfills this. "The Lord who you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap." In other words, this is going to be some change, but it's going to hurt a little. This might sting. You might feel a little burn. in verse 3 of Malachi 3, he will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi, and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. So Malachi in this prophecy mentions that the Lord's going to come to his temple, he's going to be a purifier, a refiner, and he's going to refine the sons of Levi. What you have happening here in Matthew 21, I think Jesus is attempting that, but the sons of Levi aren't going to listen. They won't let him. You can assume that they go back to doing what they did before. And so this seems like, at the very least, an allusion to, if not a fulfillment, of Malachi 3. And it's interesting that Matthew doesn't quote this, but the allusions are certainly there. You have the Lord in his temple, and what you see happening here is he is purifying, or at least attempting to purify the house, and consequently the workers of it, the sons of Levi, even if it is done by refinery, even if it's going to hurt a little. This is what Jesus is trying to do. So he overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He drives out the buyers and the sellers here in the temple. And after doing all of this, Jesus begins to teach. He quotes Scripture to them. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." This is actually two quotations by Jesus here. He kind of meshes them together. The first part of this comes from Isaiah 56 in verse 7, where it says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." That's what the temple is supposed to be. This is, keep in mind, where God's presence is manifested among the people, in the temple. And so you think about things that God represents. His house being a house of prayer is something that he intends for it to be. But you see how things have come about by the time Jesus is here in making this demonstration. He alludes to Jeremiah 7 and verse 11, "You make it a den of robbers." That's something that is said of the Jews before they get sent into exile. And so that connotation is that of judgment. There's judgment that's coming, which perhaps is foreshadowing something else. And so what you see in this is this highlights the sad state of affairs of what has happened to God's house, what has happened to the temple. What should have been a house of prayer has instead become a den of robbers. And that word that's used, that's translated as robbers, some versions may use the word thieves, it implies that this theft is done forcibly, perhaps even violently. One lexicon I was reading said that you could translate that word, if you wanted to, as highwaymen, which, if you know what a highwayman is, it's an old thing. You don't see them much anymore, but someone on horseback who would rob people on roads as they're going back and forth. You're probably thinking of the supergroup with Waylon and Johnny Cash and all of them, but these were robbers. And that is what, unfortunately, has taken shape in the temple. Go ahead, Brad.
You just think of what an amazing thing this is, that Jesus drives out the money changers. It's the second time he's done it, but he drives out the money changers, and they don't stop it.
Yeah.
They don't. There isn't a arresting crew come by. The people just delight in this because he's returning the temple to them, and it's just remarkable how he has this authority to do this. To me, it's just a resounding approval of God.
Yeah. Yeah, Brad brings up an interesting point, and one thing he mentioned that I didn't mention, this is actually the second time that Jesus has done this. We don't see the first time in Matthew, but in John's gospel account, Jesus does this at the very beginning of his ministry, as John depicts it there. So you could assume Jesus did this at least twice, and he does it once, and then it goes right back to the way it is. And you can tell by secular history that they go back to doing things before ultimately the temple is destroyed. And Jesus does this, and no one stops him. Now, later in this chapter, they'll question his authority, But they don't question that he has authority. They question where he got it from. That's an interesting point, and we'll get to that eventually, depending on what rate we go. Everett?
Isaiah 56, verse 7, that I've never noticed, but recently I studied Mark 11 in this connection. And for my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. The Lord God, verse 8, who gathers out the outcasts of Israel, declares, I will gather yet others to him besides those already gathered. So it looks like the marketplace was where the Gentiles were to be. And now it's a marketplace. It's not a place for them. But the temple was ultimately for everybody. We know that God was going to invite not just Jews into the church, but Gentiles as well. Anyhow, I never noticed that before until a recent study. So it's interesting that Jesus quotes that passage.
Yeah, Everett mentioned, if you didn't hear him, the quotation from Isaiah 56 mentions that it's not just a house of prayer for the Jews, but for all people. It's a place where all people will be able to come. It's a little bit of foreshadowing there of the inclusion of the Gentiles later on, not just the Jews. All right, so there is speculation when you think of this instance of this protest or this demonstration done by Jesus as to why he would do this. What is the motivation behind this? What is it that Jesus is wanting to convey? Is he expressing disapproval? I think you could certainly say that. Is he wanting reformation? I think you could certainly say that. Some speculate, perhaps, there's also a little bit of foreshadowing here of the destruction of the temple. This is something Jesus is going to talk about later in Matthew chapter 24. So what is the motivation? Perhaps it's all of the above. You can see each of these things working here. There's obvious disapproval here, which for the Son of God to come in and do this shows that it's not just Jesus who disapproves of it, but it's God. This is God's house, keep in mind, and he is not happy with what has been going on. So you obviously would want reformation. You want things to be the way that God intended them to be. But there's also foreshadowing here, because what you really have happening here, the temple himself is in the temple. And Jesus, of course, his temple will be raised after 3 days. So this is very clearly a rejection by Jesus, rejecting what is going on at the temple. These practices that are going on are not acceptable. And so Jesus very clearly rejects these. And so what you have here with what is going on at this time with the temple, what was supposed to be a consecrated place, think about this. This is the manifestation of God's presence there with them. This is supposed to be consecrated, holy, set apart. And yet it has become commercialized. It's become a place of business, a place of theft, as Jesus alludes to. It's become commercialized, and it has given way to corruption. And so what is supposed to be consecrated has become common, and not just common, but corrupt. And so this is a very strong rejection that Jesus gives here of what is going on, not just in the temple, but perhaps big picture what has gone on in the Jewish religion as a whole at that time. And so you can see this unfolding here, this rejection that Jesus is giving to the Jewish leaders and to the temple practices. And there's a big contrast between what they are doing in the temple versus what Jesus is about to do in the temple in verse 14. Because he's now done this demonstration, but see what he does in verse 14. It says, the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. This is the final healing that is performed by Jesus in Matthew. There's been a number of different healings. This is the last one. And so this is kind of an interesting thing on the one hand, because think about what is about to happen. Jesus' death is imminent. It is coming. It is a matter of just days away. And it also takes place in the temple. The fact that it's in the temple is very interesting. And the reason for this is because Jews did not allow the lame and the blind in the temple. And this comes from 2 Samuel chapter 5. This is kind of an odd story. This comes when David first becomes king, and he overtakes the Jebusites, and he captures what we know as Jerusalem. And so he takes Jerusalem from the Jebusites. That, of course, is where the temple is going to be and where the temple was as Jesus was doing these things. And yet in 2 Samuel 5, we read of an instance where David barred the blind and the lame from coming to the temple after defeating these Jebusites. And so he takes Jerusalem from the Jebusites. They owned it previously, but then David takes it. And notice this from 2 Samuel chapter 5. David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house being the future temple." So you see a contrast here. In 2 Samuel 5, the principle is laid out, the blind and the lame cannot enter the house of God. Well, notice the contrast with Jesus. And this is interesting because this is David and the son of David. It shows us that the son of David is better than David. He's the fulfillment of what David could not be. And so instead of barring them, Jesus heals them. That's a pretty big difference between what David had done versus what Jesus does here. And it's also a big difference between what Jesus does and what the Jewish leaders were doing. It's become a corrupt place. They are stealing. Jesus, on the other hand, is healing. And so it's an interesting dynamic that's playing out here with this contrast, not just between Jesus and David, but between Jesus and these Jewish leaders. And the contrast becomes more imminent when you see how these Jewish leaders react to what's going on. We read in verses 15 and 16 that the chief priests and the scribes, who keep in mind have been absent from the story for the most part, but now they're in the picture and they're going to play an important role in Jesus' demise. And we read here that they are indignant about these wonderful things in verses 15 and 16. That word indignant is very strong. That's not just a dislike. It's a strong hatred that they are feeling. It's a strong anger that they're feeling. It is a rageful and wrathful way of feeling. And they feel that way about what Matthew describes as wonderful things. And I have wonderful in quotes there because this is the one time in the entire Bible that this particular, or in the New Testament I should say, because it's used in the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament, but it's the only time in the New Testament that this particular Greek word is used. And so it's interesting that Matthew uses it here. And notice the contrast that's being shown here, because on the one hand, you see what things Jesus has just shown his disapproval of. The money changers, the price gouging, and the buying and selling, and the commercialism that has taken place in what should have been a house of prayer. They seem unbothered by that. They let it go on, and in fact, they're complicit in it happening. Not only did they allow it, but they benefited from it. And so they are unbothered, if not perhaps even complicit, in the corruption and the commercialization that is going on in the temple. Yet Jesus heals the blind and the lame, and we'll see later on part of what they're indignant toward is Jesus being praised in the temple. There are these wonderful things that are going on, and that's what they get indignant about. The contrast could not be any clearer between God and Jesus and how these Jewish leaders have failed monumentally. And among these things are, again, children crying out in the temple, and in particular praising Jesus. This, once again, we saw this with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, but once again, there's an allusion here to Psalm 118 when they say, Hosanna to the Son of David. That word Hosanna means save us, we pray, and that's the opening line of Psalm 118. And so there's another allusion to this here, and that word could also simply mean praise, and I think that's how they're using it here. Praise be to the Son of David. And there's another contrast here. A lot of contrast here going on, and it just gets worse and worse for the Jewish leaders. Because you can not only pin them against Jesus, which you pin any of us against Jesus, we're going to lose, but especially these Jewish leaders. But they even lose against these children, because these children have it together better than these leaders do. When you have children who have a better idea than the Jewish leaders, that really is a failure on their part. And so they ask the question, the chief priests and the scribes, do you hear what these are saying? As if to say, are you going to take credit for what they're saying? Are you going to affirm what they're saying? They're saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Are you really going to confirm that? Well, Jesus, he doesn't deny the claims that are made, but nor does he implicitly confirm them either, but you could say he perhaps confirms them by what he does. And what he does is he draws them to Scripture. And in particular, he draws them to Psalm 2, where he says, have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise. That again comes from Psalm 8. Psalm 8 is one of the most quoted Psalms in the entire New Testament, because there's a lot of things in there. The thing about, what are you mindful of the Son of Man? You've made him a little lower than the angels. That is in Psalm 8. That's quoted several times. And there are other things in Psalm 8 that are quoted quite a lot. And it's interesting that Jesus quotes this part, perhaps because of the mention of infants and nursing babes. So in conclusion to this story, to what is going on here, this scene of Jesus in the temple, it showcases an incredible case of irony. We're going to see more and more of this as we get closer to Jesus' death, because Jesus' death is pinnacle irony when you think about it. The perfect person, sinless person, dying the death of a criminal. It doesn't get any more ironic than that. That's a complete reversal of the way things should be. And in this scene here of events, we have a lot of irony going on. Thinking kind of big picture-wise, the ones who think they're in charge, this would be the scribes and the Pharisees, we see that not only are they incompetent, they're corrupt, they're complicit in the corruption, and in this story, we see that they're really not the ones in charge. Because what's happening? The king is in his house. Jesus is the one who is in charge. And so instead of them being in charge, the one who rode in humbly on a donkey and a colt, he's the one who's in charge. He is the king. Jesus is the authority as to what goes in the temple. They allowed these things to happen, the corruption and the money changers and the price gouging and all of that. They were implicit in that. They benefited from it. They allowed it to happen. Jesus comes in. He shows his disapproval toward these things. Another thing here is the Lord is in his temple. And so imagine the king comes to his house. The king comes to his palace. The king comes and sits on his throne. How would the subjects react to that? Instead of being praised, our king is questioned. And instead of being glorified, he faces indignation. They are indignant toward these things that are happening toward Jesus. And so this is incredibly ironic. Another thing that's ironic is the king, who, keep in mind, is in his house, he's in his palace, the king who has chief status, he heals those who are without status. The blind and the lame were typically barred from the temple, like we read from 2 Samuel 5. David barred them from being able to come in. And yet here they do come. And not only are they allowed to be there, but the king heals them. That's incredibly ironic, and that's a big reversal as to what was typically the case. You can also contrast the Jewish leaders with these children, who, of course, were shouting, or crying out rather, in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David. So on the one hand, you have these children, and yet you have the leaders who are not only opposed to Jesus, but they are indignant toward him. It's one thing to be opposed to somebody. You can be opposed to someone and not hate them. You can be opposed to someone and not be mad at them. But they are indignant toward Jesus and towards what is happening. This is a strong feeling that they have. And you contrast that with the children who are praising Jesus. The children get it right. The Jewish leaders who are supposed to be the informed ones, they have it very, very wrong. And finally, you see the concerns of the leaders. This is perhaps the biggest contrast of them all. They don't seem the least bit concerned of the fact that God's house, which is supposed to be a place of prayer, has turned into a den of robbers. They don't seem concerned about that at all. But rather, their concern, what they are indignant toward, it's not the corruption that's going on. It's not like Jim has spent a couple of weeks preaching on hating what is evil. They're not hating what's evil. They're complicit in it, and instead they're hating the Son of God there in their midst. Their concern is in Jesus healing other people and in Jesus being praised. That's their concern. The contrast could not be any clearer.
And Jesus, David, the only thing David could do is just forbid them from coming in. He couldn't heal them.
Yeah.
And Jesus heals every one of them. It's just a remarkable contrast.
Yeah.
And David was a good man. He just couldn't do it.
Hey, David couldn't heal him, but Jesus could and did. And so what you see happen here, in verse 17, Jesus leaves. Now, on the one hand, this is what happens. He walks out of the temple. He'll come back later on. But perhaps this is symbolic as well. Although he will come back to the temple. We'll read that when you get to verse 23. He'll enter the temple again. But perhaps what you see happening here isn't just something that's physical, but something that is symbolic in the sense that Jesus has now turned his back on the priests and the scribes. He realizes they're too far gone. The temple no longer serves its purpose. It's no longer a house of prayer. But there's something coming that will serve this purpose. Something that will come later on, something that Jesus himself will establish. That being, of course, his church. What the temple could not do, God's temple of today will accomplish. We're out of time. Any last-second comments? Steve?
It said the blind and lame couldn't come in is because the Jebusites said the blind and lame wouldn't let him come in, that they would keep him out. He can't get past them. So David said, whoever gets up there, because there was a water shaft, whoever gets inside the city and kills one of them, he can be my commander. Joab went up. That's why Joab was the commander. He went up, started killing them, and got the gate open so they could come in. The reason David told them they couldn't come in is because they said the blind will keep them out. And then since then, they've had some guys try to climb that water shaft. They know where it's at. They don't know how he got up there.
And Steve points out the context of what I mentioned from 2 Samuel 5, which is important. That kind of makes David seem hateful, but it's kind of retaliatory, if that's the right word. The Jebusites said, the blind and the lame won't let you get in here. Well, they got in there, right? And then then David bars them from coming back in. And there's a big context as to why that is. I'll let 2 Samuel 5 speak for itself. All right, thanks for your attention.